Prayers.
Let us pray. Guide us, Lord, in all our doings with your gracious favor. Further us your continual help. That in all our works begun, continued, and ended in you, we may glorify your holy name, and finally by your mercy attain everlasting life, through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen. Continue to pray at this time for protection against hurricanes. Father, all the elements of nature obey your command. Calm any storm or hurricane that may threaten us at this time, and turn our fear of your power into praise of your goodness. Through our Lord Jesus Christ, your Son, who lives and reigns with you in the unity of the Holy Spirit, one God, forever and ever. Amen. Almighty God, our Heavenly Father, send forth, we beseech thee, upon thy servants who bear office in this country, the spirit of charity and justice, that they may in all things walk before thee with steadfast purpose and a single heart, and faithfully serve in their several offices, through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen. Most gracious God, author of all good things, we humbly beseech thee for the Parliament of Barbados, especially the Senate at this time assembled, that thou wouldst be pleased to direct and prosper all their counsels to the advancement of thy glory, the good of thy church, and the safety, honor, and welfare of our people. All this we ask in the name of Jesus Christ, our most blessed Lord and Savior. Amen. And together we say the Lord's Prayer. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive them that trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom, the power, and the glory, forever and ever. Amen. And may the grace of our Lord Jesus Christ, and the love of God, and the fellowship of the Holy Spirit be with us all now and forevermore. Amen.
The Senate is in session.
Messages from Her Excellency the President.
I have received the following communication from Her Excellency the President to the Honourable the Senate. It reads as follows. Her Excellency the President wishes to inform the Honourable the Senate that she will be absent from the office during the period 14th August 2023 to 2nd September 2023 on vacation leave. Her Excellency further wishes to inform the Honourable the Senate that, in accordance with the provisions of Section 33 of the Constitution, the Very Reverend Dr. Jeffrey Douglas Gibson will perform the functions of the Office of President for the period of Her Excellency's absence, signed by Her Excellency the President at State House on the 13th of August 2023.
Announcements by Your Honor the President.
Minutes of our meeting on Wednesday, August 9th, 2023, to be deferred. Senator Cummings.
Mr. President, I beg to move that the minutes of the meeting held on Wednesday, August 9th, 2023 be deferred.
The question is that the minutes of our meeting held on Wednesday, August 9th, 2023 be deferred. Honourable senators in favour, please say aye. Aye. Those against, please say no. The things yes have it, those minutes are accordingly deferred. Other announcements. We have indications of late arrival from Senator Kevin Boyce, Senator Christopher Maynard, Senator Lyndall Nurse. I want to welcome a number of guests that are sitting today. We're very pleased to have members of Integrity Group Barbados, specifically Andy Armstrong, Lydia McCollin, and Devon Bruce. Welcome. I'm sure you're looking forward to today's debate. We're happy to have you with us. Want to welcome former Senator Vera Brathwaite, who is gracing us with her presence as well. Very happy to have you. Welcome back to the Honourable of the Senate. We have as well a number of law students from the Newton Law School. So these are budding lawyers who may one day grace us with their presence here. There are Ashley Edwards, Devandra Webster, Riandra Marshall, Pierre Cook, Mika Blackman, Suthany, Hall, and Regina Seeley. Welcome to all of you, and I hope that this period in our chamber will reinforce the importance of the area of law that you've chosen. We are all guided by law. We are lawmakers, yes, but we can only operate within the limits of the Constitution, the supreme law of our land, and then we are guided by standing orders and other guidelines which are derived from the Constitution and relevant legislation. So hope all of you enjoy our sit-in today, and I welcome all of you.
Presentation of petitions, presentation of papers, reports from select committees, questions to ministers, requests for leave to move the adjournment of the Senate on matters of urgent public importance, statements by ministers or parliamentary secretaries, personal explanations, motions relating to the business or citizens of the Senate moved by minister, introduction of bills, public business.
Public business is now the order of the day.
Order number 1, sir. In the name of the Honourable Leader of the Senate, to move the second reading of the Integrity in Public Life Bill 2023.
Senator Cummings.
Mr. President, thank you very much for the opportunity today to present this. I want to call it a signal piece of legislation for our country. There has been, without doubt, a lot of conversation and a lot of interest generated in this bill. And I want to begin my presentation today, Mr. President, by expressing my appreciation to the group sitting to my right, behind me, the Integrity Group of Barbados. Let me declare up front that prior to 2020, prior to 2018, I believe it was, prior to 2018, when I was appointed to this honorable chamber as a government senator, I previously had been myself a member, and I hope an active member, of the Integrity Group of Barbados, because philosophically, I subscribe to the principles of integrity in public life. I had obviously to ensure that there had been a separation between myself and IGB, and so once I assumed the role of senator, I no longer was a member of IGB, but I supported the work of the IGB. And why is that, Mr. President? Why would I have joined a group called Integrity Group Barbados? One, Mr. President, let us declare upfront, I, like every other Barbadian, sat through the previous 10 years of 2008 to 2018 in horror. We saw on multiple occasions, not just allegations or accusations or anecdotal commentary about how public funds were being used, but we saw so many instances where we could see clear challenges with not just the way in which public funds were being used, the chatter on the street about what was being done with those public funds, but perhaps more importantly, Mr. President, the fact that no one was held accountable at the time by their own leadership for their challenges at the time. And so, Mr. President, that was one component of it. I also, Mr. President, was a young Foreign Service officer, and I served in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs at the time for 10 years as a Foreign Service officer, and served as the UN desk officer for several years. And it was a point of challenge for us, Mr. President, that a convention that Barbados signed in 2003, namely the United Nations Convention Against Corruption, could not be signed into law because it had not been domesticated into domestic law several years afterwards. It wasn't until this government, Mr. President, that we then change what would have been the 1930s legislation, I believe it was 1929 legislation, that covered corruption, which was grossly inadequate for the purpose for which it was intended, that those things, Mr. President, imbued in me a sense of responsibility to become more active in not just talking about the things that I wanted to see in my country, but doing something about them. And so I actively wanted to ensure that Barbados, not a political group, not a political party, but that Barbados was represented in the best possible way at all times, both at home and internationally, and that we complied with the international obligations that we committed to. How could we have signed a convention in 2003, participated in its development, and then not domesticated it into international law? Mr. President, I also remember being an officer based at the time in Washington, D.C., at our embassy in Washington. At the time, there was an OAS convention also against corruption, Organization of American States Convention. We also, Mr. President, failed to implement the provisions of that legislation into domestic law. So we then had, Mr. President, a situation in the country where so much needed to be done in the country, but you did not have a legislative framework despite the political commitment at the international level to be able to implement and to hold persons accountable for their actions. Now, the Integrity Group of Barbados, as a consequence, like so many other groups across Barbados, had an interest in the subject. What attracted me to this group was that a lot of people talk. And I'm happy to have and welcome, along with you, Mr. President, the young students from Hugh Wooding Law School who are here with us. Some familiar faces we're happy to have here with us in the chamber. Those of you who are advocates, Pierre Cook, for example, who is here with us, you are very much a well-known advocate and have spoken on a range of issues on a public platform about things about which you're passionate. But passion is important, yes, but it has to be buttressed by information. Has to be buttressed by information that is accurate. It has to be buttressed by research. It has to be buttressed by fact. That is what caught my attention about the Integrity Group of Barbados. They spent the time doing the research, understanding what was happening, not just locally, but globally. And this is not a plug for any specific group, Mr. President, but it is a best practice example. Because in Barbados, we have a conversation a lot of times about, is my mouth I can say what I like? You can, as long as you have a microphone or a recorder, and these days a cell phone and a computer, and you have the anonymity of saying what you like. If people don't understand the facts, they haven't done the research, they don't understand the information and how to analyze the information, Mr. President, whatever comes out of your mouth, which could be abject nonsense, somebody is going to run with that as truth. But wait, you hear what them people up in the government doing? And all of a sudden, that becomes the next viral voice note or the subject of a conversation in the mainstream media. Facts are important, and who you align yourself for the purpose of procuring or getting access to those facts, and that analysis, it matters. And so I would not have aligned myself with a group that I was not comfortable was taking the time to do the research. Equally so, Mr. President, fast forward now, 2018 and since, I am a member of the Barbados Labour Party. I am a member of the government of Barbados and a member of the cabinet of Barbados. I would not, Mr. President, align myself, having outlined all that I have said, with a group of people in whom I did not have confidence. And where does that confidence come from, Mr. President? I want to begin, Mr. President, by speaking about a little bit about how this bill then aligns with the philosophy of a group of people represented on the government side of this table that I am officially, formally, and publicly aligned, Mr. President. I am, over the course of my presentation, going to speak about what is corruption versus what is integrity, a little bit about that, because the two are not to be conflated. I am going to be talking about both the supply and the demand side factors, and I am going to be speaking a little bit, Mr. President, about what we have done as a government. Now, while we are here, Mr. President, to go through the Integrity in Public Life bill, and I'm going to go through that in some detail today, I want us to be very clear. The government of Barbados, led by Mia Motley, the Honourable Prime Minister of Barbados since 2018, has undertaken not just to treat to the questions of integrity in public life in this particular piece of legislation, but a group that spends time, or a group of people who would spend time researching the facts, would find these facts available to them. In 2019, Mr. President, we passed the Public Finance Management Act, and I'm going to go back to that legislation today for a very specific reason. In 2021, Mr. President, we passed further regulations to the Public Finance Management Act. In 2021, Mr. President, we had the Public Procurement Act. Public Procurement Act, Mr. President, we always had in the Barbados context, but then when the CARICOM region had a public procurement bill and they had model legislation across the region, we made further changes to that. Public procurement, the awarding of contracts and how that is managed. So even things down to unsolicited bids. How are those things managed? So somebody sees a project, they think that this is a good idea, they come to the government and they say, look, we want to do this, and they submit a project. How do you treat to those things? All of those elements are now captured in the public procurement legislation. We also have, Mr. President, a dedicated piece of legislation as at 2021 to implement the obligations assumed by Barbados in 2003 upon signature of the anti-corruption legislation of the United Nations. That was done by this government in 2021, Mr. President. This bill is not a magic pill. It is not a standalone set of legislation. It is for the Barbados Labour Party government that I am a part of, and I'm proud to be the leader of government business on this particular bill in this honourable chamber, Mr. President. This is a suite of legislative reforms that this government has undertaken since coming to office in 2018. It is not a stand-alone piece of legislation. If there is any doubt, Mr. President, that this government is committed to preventing corruption and ensuring integrity in public life, it can be found in the pieces of legislation and more that I have raised. And why do I say more, Mr. President? If we were to go back to the bill, I had the opportunity in 2019, when this bill first came to this chamber, or to this parliament, I should say, to be a member of the Senate who sat on the Select Committee, the Joint Select Committee. That Joint Select Committee report, Mr. President, is available on the Parliament website. I commend it to all of you, especially the law students who are with us today, to read it. It is a lengthy and voluminous document, but it gives great insights about the various perspectives on a single piece of legislation. Each time you have a problem, Mr. President, and I want through you, Mr. President, to perhaps make a point to our young law students who are with us today, there is never a single solution. And whenever you hear anyone saying, all the government got to do is this, but the government doing all of that, and then all it has to do is that, is this. It is a simplistic way of thinking, and therefore it is a simplistic approach to policy making, because there's never a single thing that anything is about. So if you were to read that report, you would see groups including the Barbados Bar Association, Integrity Group of Barbados, the Institute of Chartered Accountants of Barbados, political parties, including the Democratic Labour Party. At the time, there was a plethora of independent parties in the post-2018 period. Many of them, I believe 3 of them, made presentations to the Joint Select Committee. We had a number of individuals who, in their own right, felt passionate enough about the issue. They too came and made presentations. There were people who submitted written presentations. There were people who took the time to go clause by clause by clause by clause, section by section by section through the entire bill, create a matrix, and to make submissions to the Joint Select Committee. What was the Joint Select Committee's responsibility, Mr. Chairman? It was to go through those divergent, not singular, points of view on a substantive piece of legislation and come to a coherent policy position on the basis not only of what was in front of it, but on the basis, Mr. President, of what existed in our existing constitution, looking at what existed in other jurisdictions that had gone in this direction before, looking at what obtained in the international community by way of the international instruments that we were domesticating into law in Barbados, looking at case law, Mr. President, to see who had challenged which pieces of legislation and what was contained therein, and making sure that we avoided those pitfalls. It was a comprehensive review process in a joint select committee, which was constituted by members of the Senate and members of the House of the other place, Mr. President. We also had the benefit of legal expertise, and I want to take the opportunity here to commend the former Chief Justice of Barbados, Sir David Simmons, who was not stingy with his time. He came not only and made a formal presentation on the basis of the legislation on integrity that existed in Turks and Caicos Islands, which this legislation draws heavily from, but he also took the time to respond to points of specific concern. Issues relating to the inclusion of judges in the legislation, looking at what happened in other jurisdictions, issues relating to trust structure, issues relating to queries that have been raised by some of the submissions by interested parties that presented to the stakeholder, to the Joint Select Committee, Mr. President. It was a comprehensive process. When that process was done, Mr. President, we then began the hard work of crafting what could be incorporated, what couldn't be incorporated, what was best practice, what needed to be incorporated but framed slightly differently. And the result of that, Mr. President, is the bill you have before you now, today, 2023, but also we made a determination based on submissions in the Joint Select Committee, based on the process that I have just outlined to you that took place in and after the Joint Select Committee, that there were some elements that were originally included in the TCI legislation that Barbados had drawn heavily on, and in the original draft, there were significant enough issues raised by stakeholders and by legal advisors that they deserved standalone legislation. So this government that had already by that time, Mr. President, passed the Public Finance Management Act that I spoke about, passed the regulations to the Public Financial Management Act that I also spoke about, had already passed the public procurement legislation, Mr. President, had already made all of these changes, had then also made the following amendments. We then, as I talked about before, passed in 2021 the anti-corruption legislation because that stood on its own. Whistleblower protection, which was included in TCI, which was included in the original bill that was considered by the Select Committee, deserved standalone consideration. And therefore, Mr. President, in 2021, this government drafted and passed standalone whistleblower legislation as opposed to containing it within the integrity bill that you now have before. So it wasn't here before, it was taken out, standalone legislation. We have that. We also have, Mr. President, the Proceeds and Instrumentalities of Crime Act. That was passed in 2019. Those are things which were included. But, Mr. President, I could go further. I also happen to be the minister with responsibility for international business, and so cross-border finance is a concern for my ministry and for my officials. And so issues relating to anti-terrorism, which fall under the Office of the Attorney General, legislation has come, anti-money laundering, anti-terrorism, the proceeds of crime legislation, all passed by this government, Mr. President. And I want, if there's nothing else that you hear me say this: there is never a single perspective on anything. That is a simplistic way of thinking that must never characterize who you are. There are always either a duplicity or a multiplicity of factors before you. And you must consider all of them based on research, sober analysis, and a clear and measured determination of the facts before you, not whatever knee-jerk reaction you feel in the moment. That's foolishness. That's not for your thought process, Mr. President. And so the suite of legislation that I have just outlined is not a magic bullet on its own, but they all must be taken together alongside this piece of legislation that today we are now debating. This is going to add, Mr. President, to the existing bodies of legislation that we already have before us. Now, I wanted, Mr. President, to begin frontally to raise some of the issues that were raised in the last presentation of this bill. There are a few of us who were in the last Senate and who therefore would remember what were some of the concerns. Mr. President, one of those concerns was the issue specific to the inclusion of public officials. I want to deal with that early. There is a conversation, Mr. President, raging in this country that is deeply problematic. It is understandable, but it is problematic. And it speaks not to anything other than the fact that last week when we were here, Mr. President, we had a number of primary school children who came to visit. They were here for a civics class exercise. The teaching of civics and governance in this country is at an all-time critical requirement level. We have to teach people, citizens, especially with the advent of everyone having a view on everything, how a country is actually governed in terms of the structure of government, Mr. President. And so there's a conversation around whether or not elected officials should be the focus of legislation like this, or if it should include public officials. That was one of the issues that was raised in the last Senate when this was presented, and I want to speak to that up front. But in order to speak to that, Mr. President, I want to go back to a piece of legislation. Not integrity, Mr. President, not at all, not even integrity. I want, Mr. President, to go to the 2019 Public Finance Management Act. And I want to draw attention, Mr. President, to sections 12 and there onward. Everywhere in that legislation from section 12, it outlines the role of the Director of Finance. It outlines the role, Mr. President, of Chief Executive Officers, the role of the Comptroller General, and the role of a permanent secretary. Public officials, all of them, Mr. President, not elected, all public officials. And I want to draw your attention to the following, specifically the role of the permanent secretary as defined in the Public Finance Management Act. A permanent secretary, where designated as an accounting officer under Section 18, shall be responsible for administering the expenditure head or part of an expenditure head in the annual budget that is under the control of the public entity, administering each item or part of an item of statutory expenditure in the annual budget or under an act that is under the control of the given entity, administering each item of revenue or part of an item of revenue in the annual budget that is under the control of the public entity, providing policy advice to the minister, assisting the minister to oversee the entities that he's responsible for, other functions as defined in rules made under this act for accounting officers, and other responsibilities set out in Section 16. This is a permanent secretary. But if I were to replicate that, Mr. President, the Accountant General maintaining the accounts of the government as to show the current state of the consolidated funds and other funds and the financial position of the government, receiving and banking or overseeing the receipt and banking of public money and overseeing in disbursement, including overseeing the opening and closing of bank accounts. And I could go on, Mr. President. It goes on to say maintaining arrangements for the management of government's cash, preparing the financial statements and any other financial statements or reports required by the minister responsible for finance or director of finance, verifying that payments are processed in, you get the point, right? These are accounting officers, Mr. President. These are the persons who hold the public purse. By law, no minister of government or no elected official can be an accounting officer. That is a matter of governance that I believe we need to make clear for the country. No elected official can sign a check, receive a check, sign even contracts. Oftentimes, those things are done by the accounting officer. In our overseas missions, Mr. President, and you would know well, having served in one of our missions abroad in Canada. In our overseas missions, you can have an ambassador, you can have a high commissioner, and they could be persons who are in the public eye at all times. They're the ones giving speeches, they're the ones meeting the foreign government officials, they're the ones engaging with the government on the other side and representing the interests of people. They cannot sign anything of an accounting nature. There is a designated accounting officer, even in our overseas missions, and that person is the most senior public official. The most senior public, not elected, public official in the embassy. The notion, therefore, Mr. President, that if by law, the power of the purse and the power of accounting is held by public officials and not elected officials, that you can have legislation that excludes said accounting officer is a misnomer. And it suggests that those who feel that way have not understood the structure of governance in a parliamentary democracy. That's what it suggests, Mr. President. I don't sign a check. I cannot. I do not. There are things, Mr. President, sometimes that I hear are happening in my own ministry that I wouldn't know. I would have no idea because there are contracts and relationships that are exercised outside of ministerial authority. So Barbados has to make a decision. You want ministers to be responsible, but you don't want us to be accountable. So I have no financial accountability except to the Prime Minister who appointed me, and at the end of the day, whether I know or not, whether I have signed the check or not, when I sit before the Prime Minister as a chairman of cabinet and as a minister with responsibility for finance in the estimates debate, I am accountable for whatever happened among those who are public officers, who are the accounting officers. So I have to take responsibility, even if I don't know. I have to make sure I know. So now what do? On a quarterly basis, I make sure. On a weekly basis, I usually have management meetings, sometimes every 2 weeks. But on a quarterly basis, I go through the heads of expenditure assigned to my ministry. I go through to see what the absorptive capacity is, what projects we are spending on, what we are doing as given by the budget and the estimates of expenditure that come to this place. And I follow through on those things. But you see things like government procurement, you see things like goods and services in line items, I would never see those. I will never be able to tell you how much paper we buy. I will never be able to tell you who we buy it from. That's not the stuff that comes to a minister's attention. It is not the stuff that comes to an elected official's attention. So we have to understand how governance works, and therefore, I want to first debunk the notion that public officials who are accounting officers are to be excluded from legislation like this. When I first moved back home to Barbados, Mr. President, I moved back to Barbados, not the last time, the time before. And I heard so many people tell me stories. When you bring home your things, Ms. Madam Deputy President, I don't know if you've had this experience, but I doubt. You are a formidable character and they probably may not try that with you. But you get people who would offer, if you pay the duties and taxes, this is the price. If you don't want a receipt, this is the price. That's corruption, Mr. President, and them elected. You understand? If you want to get a driver's license, but you don't want to go through the process of learning how to drive, but you know somebody who knows somebody who's your aunt's sister friend. All right? You pay to get what you want. That's corruption. Let me elect it. Right? When you want to get a job and you decide that you know somebody who knows somebody and you're going to ask them to do something for you, They do it for you, but then there is a relationship that says, but this is what I want you to do for me. I hire you, but I want to use this contract. I want to do this contract, and I want to make sure that I get a kickback from this contract. And you say, all right, but I want the job, so I can help you, I can do it. And you have the authority to sign, or to approve, or to do banking. That's corruption, though. Right? That's not integrity. So let us not have this false notion going out there that corruption takes place or integrity in public life is an elected officials thing. Not when elected officials can't sign or disburse checks. There has to be, or there must always be, Prime Minister has a way of saying it. She uses, there must be two hands to clap. And the hands that are clapping in symphony, because they're not only two hands, the hands that are clapping in symphony must all be accountable under the law. This law does that. It draws public officials and it defines how those public officials are, who those public officials are in the schedule appended to the bill. Mr. President, it is an extensive list of persons. The second schedule of the bill, which is where I'm starting now, it outlines in part 1, members of the House of Assembly and the Senate. That brings me, Mr. President, deliberately, I wanted to start there with those persons as to why the Senate is included, Mr. President. Mr. President, since I joined this honorable chamber, 3 constitutional motions have come to this honorable chamber. For matters which require a simple majority, the government senators, who constitute the appointed representatives of the elected party in the other place, the people, you ain't just coming here because any individual voted. The people voted and they chose a political party to lead them. And the people then have representatives in the other place. And the people who they voted for appointed persons to represent their interests in the upper house. The people did that. And your authority must come principally from the other place, because that's where the people power, we say, comes from, right? So the people made determinations on 3 constitutional motions. Simple majorities can be carried on anything with 12 government votes. But the Senate has the ability, even if you have 30 persons in the other place, to say, we don't support this and we are voting against this. You have the opportunity, by sitting in the Senate, to change government policy or to affect government policy, even as an unelected non-representative of anybody except you have declared yourself to be so. So the notion that you would then be excluded from influence because you don't wield the influence, you're independent, or you're an opposition senator, you're not in government, is not a true statement, even as it relates to the Senate. Because you have the ability to either support or oppose government policy, and in so doing, affect the will of an elected government. So you do have the opportunity. Many members of the Honourable Senate sit on various boards, committees, tribunals, and so on. You have the ability to affect government policy. You have the ability to affect outcomes of the entities to which you are a part. So you have to be included. That was the second issue that came in the last Senate. Members of Cabinet, myself and Senator Dr. Chantel Monroe-Knight, we are members of Cabinet, and we are bound by this legislation. But before we were bound by this legislation, Mr. President, our Prime Minister, the leader of Cabinet, chairman of Cabinet, decided, but when wait, we ain't got the integrity legislation, but you got to get some declarations though. And so both Dr. Chantel Monroe-Knight and myself and Dr. Jerome Walker, who will be with us shortly, all of us had to sign our declarations of assets, whatever little bit we own. Certainly I can only speak for myself, I can't speak to anybody else. Whatever little bit you own, whatever little bit, and we had to put those into a sealed envelope and hand them over not to the Prime Minister, but to the Cabinet Secretary for her safekeeping. Those declarations then, I had to do it in 2020, and after the election of 2022, I had to do it again, because anything that I amassed between 2020 and 2022 had to be listed. Because by the time anything, if this legislation passes today and the commission comes into effect, those declarations have to be handed over to the commissioner for the first time to be opened, unsealed and opened. And that then becomes my baseline. I have to declare what I have, even if it's a little bit. And why, Mr. President? It brings me to the third issue that was raised in the last Senate. The inclusion in this legislation, Mr. President, of both your assets and your liabilities, Mr. President. If I came to office, and I came to office having $10 that I owed courts, $100 that I owed, ain't the cost of money no more, Massey, that I owed, Massey, I show my age, right? I owed Massey, and I had a mortgage on my house for $1,000, and all of a sudden, with a reduced income, because let us be clear, let us be very, very clear. For those of us who are professionals outside of government, before joining cabinet, we took salary cuts to come into government because we came committed to serve. For some people, it's a 55% salary cut. For some people, it's a 100% salary cut. For some people, it's in the fancy thing. Let me be clear. So you give up a lucrative paying job because you came to serve. No, I want to put the Deputy President here in focus for a minute. Mr. President, this week, I sent the Deputy President a message on WhatsApp. It was a screenshot of a conversation that was unfolding on Instagram, I think it was. No, I ain't on no real social media. I don't post much. I'm only on Instagram, but just a little bit. But ridiculous me made the mistake of not following my own rules, and I looked at the comments. Who tell me to look at the comments? You never read the comments, right? That should be the basic rule. So I looked at the comments on something that was happening on Saturday. And I screenshot the comment and sent it to the Honourable Deputy President, Mr. President. And it was a comment about somebody saying that she passed some event, that public event that was happening, in her $200,000 late model car. Deputy President put me in my place and told me it costs more than that, first of all, and so they should be corrected. It was not what they said it was. It was not $200,000. It was more than that, right? But I chuckled, Mr. President, because from this honorable chamber, we have had members of the independent senators speaking about the remuneration levels for the Senate. How does it make sense, Mr. President, for a government senator, Madam Deputy President, when the remuneration levels for the Senate are less than what most custodians make in the public sector? Let's be clear, that's the comparison I want to make. Not an admin officer, not a permanent secretary, less than what most custodians make in the public sector. How does she afford to buy a car that's worth so much? Clearly, she had a job before. She was the Assistant Secretary General of the United Nations for years. Making $20,000 US a month. She's here telling me that she was making $20,000 US a month. She was the Assistant Secretary General for the UN, though. And for many of us who were professionals in our own right, anything that we own now, we owned because we were able to qualify on our salaries before we came into government. And we struggle now we are in government to make sure we are able to make our payments on a government salary because we're committed to serving. Because if you're looking to make money, this ain't the place to come. If you're looking to get rich, this ain't the place to come. If you're looking to serve, you can come. But this ain't the place to make money. So all the people who are now posturing and want to come into public life and want to be elected and want to be appointed to ministers from the Senate, and so they're representatives of the people de facto already because they're not so yet, let them come with a clear understanding it ain't the place for self-aggrandizement or self-enrichment. It's not that. And anything that you have most times in that initial declaration, Mr. President, you earned because you earned more before you came into government. So if now, Mr. President, all of a sudden on a reduced salary and all the things that you were able to be qualified for on your own, that you were able to acquire before you came into public life, all of a sudden, in a few years in public life, you ain't got no more liabilities. All of a sudden, you don't own a body, nothing more. All of a sudden, Mr. President, your liabilities have disappeared. We think, Mr. President, that we still do corruption in the same way that it used to be done maybe 30 years ago. Mr. President, it is again a simplistic view. Mr. President, we talked about elections and what happens in elections from time to time. Back in your grandparents' day, your great-grandparents' day, it used to be corned beef and biscuits. We practice corned beef and biscuits politics today? No. I'm sure that prior to 2018, we were talking about people getting flat screen TVs. Corned beef and biscuits politics we dealing with no more. So clearly, you are no longer just dealing with assets, but you must deal with liabilities, Mr. President. Is it only practical? Because if all of a sudden someone comes and pays off all of your debts, they haven't given you a check, it isn't called a handout or a kickback. You ain't driving a car from a company that you have given them contracts that then find themselves before the Public Accounts Committee, as happened in the last Senate. You ain't dealing with those kinds of overt things. You're dealing with the things that are invisible. So yes, Mr. President, liabilities must be included in integrity legislation. It talks, Mr. President, about chairpersons of state-owned enterprises, heads of departments in the public service, and holders in the same grade as that. And I have already listed, Mr. President, for the benefit of the Honourable, the Senate, the reasons why in law, under the Public Finance Management Act and the associated regulations, why a public officer so designated in the Public Finance Management Act as the accounting officer, not elected officials, the public officer is accounting officer, why they must therefore be included. It goes on, Mr. President, to identify the persons who are captured in Section 3 under a range of state-owned enterprises, statutory corporations, and in some instances as well, commercial state-owned enterprises. Excuse me. That is the rationale, Mr. President, for one, the inclusion of, I have gone through the inclusion of public officials. I have spoken, Mr. President, of the rationale for balancing public officials with elected officials. I have also gone through, Mr. President, the importance of understanding how the standalone legislation has now complemented what we have before us, and the additional pieces of legislation have also come to support the overall integrity push. And then, Mr. President, I have spoken specifically about the importance of persons who may not necessarily think themselves to be exposed, but who, by virtue of the office that they hold, have the ability to influence outcomes, whether at the level of the Senate or in the various tribunals or organizations that they serve on. Now, Mr. President, I want to come then to something that I won't spend a whole lot of time on, because I'm going to spend the second part of my presentation in its entirety on the legislation itself. But what gives rise to the need for all the legislation I have just outlined? What gives rise for the kinds of protection mechanisms that are contained within the legislation I have spoken about, which we have already passed, Mr. President? What gives rise for us to ensure that we do not use our positions of authority to abuse that position or to give undue influence to another? I was reading a study, Mr. President. The study was actually done by the International Monetary Fund, and it looked at the economics of corruption. When I was going through it last night late, Mr. President, it captured something that I wanted to pull for your benefit. It said this, Mr. President: the causes or factors that promote corruption are those that affect the demand, by the public for corrupt acts, and those that affect the supply by public officials for acts of corruption. Two hands to clap, Mr. President. The demand and the supply, basic laws of economics. Someone has to be asking for it, someone has to be supplying it. It went on to say that some of the factors affecting the demand, the most important of which were, and they listed them, Mr. President, actually I'm going to use it from the original text. So they went on to list, Mr. President, which is what captured my attention, because sometimes we take some of these things for granted. It said the causes or factors that promote corruption are those that affect the demand by the public for corrupt acts and those that affect the supply by public officials or corruption. Among the factors, Mr. President, affecting the demand, the most important are 1, regulations and authorizations. Who has the ability to authorize transactions? It says certain characteristics of the tax systems, certain spending decisions, the provision of goods and services, often at below market prices. Among the factors affecting the supply of acts of corruption are 1, the bureaucratic tradition, 2, the level of public sector wages, 3, the penalty systems, 4, institutional controls, 5, the transparency of laws, rules, and processes, and 6, the examples set by the leadership. Now, people would have us to believe that only one of those factors is to be considered. The example set by leadership. So elected officials constitute leadership, and they have to be held accountable. I think that much is clear, certainly from this government, and what we have done and are doing now. But there are more elements that have been outlined here, Mr. President, and we don't get to ignore either the duplicity or the multiplicity of factors to focus on the simplicity or the singularity that we want to have as an explanation. I have already established, Mr. President, that there is no singularity in the analysis of anything on the planet. There are always multiple factors, at least, in the consideration. And so, let us speak for a moment about the bureaucratic tradition. If I want things hurried through the system, if I want to be able to get things on an expedited basis, let's consider the Immigration Department, Mr. President. Everybody remembers when it used to be a nightmare to deal with the Immigration Department. You had to know somebody in order to get your passport back in a certain time. Now, you don't have to know a fella. You can go online. If I need my passport back in 24 hours, I can do that. If I need my passport back in 48 hours, I pay the difference, I do that. If I want to wait the regular 2 to 3 weeks, same thing. Get it done. Submit all of your information online, you do what you have to do, and you're good to go. You don't have to be held hostage to the bureaucratic tradition where everything takes longer than it should, and people feel the need to use their positions, to abuse their authority, to incentivize you to get it sped up. So you don't have to deal with the bureaucracy. Those are among the reasons why public officials must be included in this legislation. No government minister takes payment from anybody directly. There are more creative ways, and I'll come to that in a little bit. The level of public sector wages, let's talk about that, Mr. President. You think, Mr. President, that a prime minister, on the heels of the 2018 restructuring, debt restructuring, with the country facing massive fiscal crises, the possibility and the prospect, once the Credit Suisse loan was repaid with that next payment that was due in June, to have the possibility of a devaluation of the dollar looming in front of you. Which prime minister dealing with those things would simultaneously make a decision to give a salary increase for public sector workers? Right after, Mr. President, you come out of COVID, you had increased expenditure, decreased revenue. Right after, Mr. President, the government has to spend on putting over 1,600 people back in houses, Mr. President, because you had Hurricane Elsa. Right after, Mr. President, the government had to spend again on cleaning up a whole country. It isn't what we are telling you. You saw it and you lived it with your own eyes after a volcano. Which government, tell me, Mr. President, after all of that, still turns around and gives a second salaries and wages increase to public officials? Right after that, 5%. Which government, Mr. President? If you were to look at the Corruption Convention, the Anti-Corruption Convention speaks about wages and salaries and creating disincentives for people having to, or feeling as though there is a need for them to accept bribes and underhanded activities in order to survive. A government who understands sometimes the challenges that people are facing at a personal level in their own personal finances, understands that as the cost of living soars and people have less disposable income, people are paying more for this basic basket of goods that they're procuring on a monthly basis. People then needed to have a little bit more. So the breakfast that we got in 2018 translated into lunch in 2023. And so we are going down the road with public sector wages. Is it optimally what we would want, Mr. President? No, we know that already. But it's a 3-year process that has been outlined where there are incremental increases that will then take place. And for the first time in probably, I believe it's 20 years, allowances were touched. You gave people an increase in allowances. Because if people are earning what they feel to be inadequate amounts, there is a greater inclination to do things that they ought not to. I have to confess, Mr. President, I had an experience when I was living in Uganda in the period 2008 to 2013. I remember at the time, Mr. President, I was earning in USD, working as a member of the Commonwealth Secretariat. I was earning in USD, and my housing was provided, my schooling for my daughter was provided, everything was provided. I am certain that anyone who has worked for an international organization, this is the standard. And sometimes your children's tuition fees in an international school overseas can be more than what your entire law school would cost the government of Barbados for 2 years. One term, one semester may cost more. Sometimes it could be $30,000. Sometimes it could be more. It is incredibly expensive. And so, Mr. President, I remember working at the time in support of the Ministry of Trade of Uganda. And there were senior officials, the equivalent of whom sit in the leadership of ministries in Barbados. And their remuneration level on a monthly basis was the equivalent of $800 US. $800 US. Most of us can't imagine that, Mr. President. Not for the level of responsibility, because we have been taught in Barbados that education and exposure, and higher education in particular, must come with income increases. But you have people who were educated at the highest level, some of them up to PhD level, earning $800 US a month. These were the things, Mr. President, that persons like the World Bank, entities like the World Bank, wrote about to say the salaries and wages of public sector officials are an incentive to corruption. If people are not properly remunerated on a monthly basis so they can meet their daily living, their monthly living expenses, and their family living expenses, and we know, I don't want to be stereotypical, but my experience was that many of these people had large families. And when I say large families, I don't mean many children or anything like that. I mean large extended families. So they lived in the city in Kampala, but their mother and their father and whomever else may have lived up country in the village. And they had to send money back because they were the ones that got out. They were the ones that were earning. So they had significant monthly expenditure to maintain their families. $800 US is what they earned. Public sector wages have to be considered and have been considered by this government as a part of our disincentivization of corruption. Institutional controls, the same Public Finance Management Act that I put up on the table at the very beginning. Those are some of the measures of institutional control that we have also put there, Mr. President. Mr. President, the transparency of rules, laws, and processes, all of these are things which are important. Prime Minister has actually asked us to, on a monthly or at a minimum on a quarterly basis, for the leadership in our respective ministries to have what she describes as leadership development training sessions in a range of areas, so that people are not made aware only of the laws, regulations, and processes in their respective ministry, but they are allowed to be exposed to much broader processes. So these things are critical as part of your leadership development. And those are the things that we have been working on, Mr. President. So it is critical for us to ensure that the entire public sector is a part of the process, and that we now indemnify people from having an incentive to participate in corrupt acts which threaten their integrity. Now, that brings me to the second part of what I want to share, which is the specifics of the legislation itself, as I prepare to close out the introduction of this important bill. Mr. President, we have 58 clauses in this legislation. One of the important clauses which we'll cover in part 2, Mr. President, the establishment of the Integrity Commission. The Integrity Commission through sections 3 all the way through clauses 10. That commission speaks to the prosecutorial and the investigative role of the members who will constitute the commission, who will take responsibility for those sealed envelopes that we have spoken about, which will allow for the declarations to be laid. Now, Mr. President, the declarations that are to be laid, let us be clear, cover not only us as individuals, but they cover your families, including your spouses and your children. Let us also be practical. We may not like it. We may not like it. But it is equally easy for a person to make a decision, and we have had a public case where somebody got paid a not insignificant sum of money, not in this government, not post-2018, before 2018, got paid a not so insignificant sum of money. I think the number that I've heard bandied about was about $5 million, decided that they don't want to put the money in their own account, they can hide the money in their mother's account. And they put the money in their mother's account, and then, oh, lo and behold, unfortunately, the mother passes on. And all of a sudden, the lawyers have an estate to adjudicate because the mother got more than one child. And so this mother now has assets to divide among all of her children. And the person who put the money in there is hopping mad. Blue vets, that's my money. They have sunk to new law, yes. So they made these kinds of transactions in ways that then came back to haunt them and took them to low points in their lives. So, Mr. President, the reality here is that we have to make sure that we are not able to hide money or assets in your child's name, in your husband's name, or in your mother's account. Declarations, we've spoken in great detail about what those declarations are. Registrable and prohibited interests. Gifts, Mr. President. Many of us in meetings oftentimes take photos where we are either giving gifts or receiving gifts. But those are such benign little things. I give out Medford mahogany gifts. I give out rum, plantation, Mount Gay. I give out sometimes Barbados Sea Island cotton pieces with scarves and those kinds of stuff. Then what are we talking about? We're talking about gifts of a substantial nature. And if you saw, or if you've been watching the cases in the United States with members of the US Supreme Court, for example, you will see the kinds of gifts about which we are speaking. But the gifts here are talking about, at a minimum, $2,500 to report to the commission. So anything in excess of $2,500, you have to report to the commission. That would include some of the nice handbags that the ladies like. And you see all the proper effects, the side strap bags and so on, the fancy Chanel bags, all of them cost more than $2,500. So let's make sure, Mr. President, that we're clear. Conduct in public life and contraventions of the Act. Now, there are two things that I want to raise here, Mr. President. One of the things that we sought to do was to make sure we were clear on what constituted a criminal act and what was an act of omission through negligence or sometimes administrative errors. I am certain, I am not a lawyer, I had never done this before, and some of the questions that were on that declaration that I had to fill out, I did not know how to make head nor tail of them. So I had to ask a question. I had to be guided. So sometimes if someone is unsure about who they can go to for guidance, there can be an error that they did not intend. And so there has to be a way to treat to those things as opposed to an intentional omission where you deliberately leave things out of your declaration. Then, Mr. President, I want to specifically go through the schedules to the bill because they are important. And if you were to go through the report of the Select Committee, you will see that the original bill had just 2 schedules. This bill has a number of schedules which gives us greater specificity. 1, at Schedule 3, you have the declaration itself. It outlines what is to be contained in the declaration. And the report of the committee will tell you that this was drafted as an amalgam of best practice examples drawn from a number of places. Trinidad and Tobago, Jamaica, TCI in particular, the commission looked at that and drafted up the template that is captured in schedule number 3. In the Certificate of Compliance, the Certificate of Registrable Interest, and the year ending December 31st, well, in this case, it is specifically what is listed there. These are very detailed items. Report of a gift, it tells you exactly what has to be reported in the gift. And then you have the 4th schedule, which establishes a code of conduct for persons in public life. And there's one section in there that I want to draw to your attention. There are only 3 sections, so it's not a long read. 1, how to use your office. You can't speak about abuse of office if you have not defined what is required of you and how you use your office. This is outlined in the 4th schedule, the use of office, in section 1. But I specifically want to be drawing your attention to section 3, private interests and conflicts of interest. There are instances, Mr. President, and I think we have to be very clear sometimes, and I've heard the Honourable Attorney General say this. We look at what is being done in fancy places, in large jurisdictions, in large economies, where if I move from one state to the next, no one knows my name, no one knows what I've done, no one knows what I own. In Barbados, you can't walk 2 steps. There are, at best at times, 1 degree of separation between many of us. It is a small society, and we have to always put that into context when we're having these conversations about, but in the US, they did this. But in Canada, they did that. Everybody knows somebody else, Mr. President, or somebody's connected. So when we talk about private interests and conflicts of interest, you may have worked for a given company. I have come in here and I have declared I was a member of the Integrity Group of Barbados. There was a conflict of interest for me being a Government of Barbados member, sitting member of the government, and continuing as a member of the Integrity Group of Barbados. And so I had to step down. But if I was a chairman of a board, Mr. President, and I was then using my position as chairman of that board under the meaning of section 1 of the 4th schedule to then have a conflict of interest by affording a contract to a company that used to be mine, then that would constitute a conflict of interest. Mr. President, I used to be chairman of the board of directors of an entity. And while chairman of that entity, Mr. President, I came across a scenario where there were 6 contracts awarded for the provision of a certain type of service under that company. 6 contracts. 4 contracts were held by 2 companies, and the remaining 2 contracts were split by another 2 companies. So 4 companies, but 6 contracts. One of those contracts, Mr. President, was held by the former chairman of the same entity. So you are chairman of the board, but awarding a contract simultaneously to your company. That is what we call private interest and conflict of interest. You cannot, in the exercise of your responsibilities as a chairman or a director on a board, award contracts to your business that is your private interest. You cannot do it. You have to declare it, you have to recuse yourself, you have to do all kinds of things. That is what is captured, Mr. President, in the 4th schedule. The 5th schedule outlines the oaths required of the members of the commission. This is a serious role that they will be undertaking, and so the oaths are prescribed here. All of us were sworn when we became members of the Senate, and those oaths we have to take seriously. They were administered by the President, initially by the Governor General, then when she became the President, we all re-swore. These are the same basic things, and we take them seriously, and so we expect that persons who are therefore employed or appointed in these roles, that they equally will treat to their oaths in the same way. These are the schedules to the bill, Mr. President. The Commission has the authority to summon and examine witnesses, to engage in inquiries, to take witness statements, and to have marshals functioning as well, and they have a direct correlated relationship with the Director of Public Prosecutions. These are among the things that we have captured in the legislation that I would want to bring to your attention, Mr. President. This is a serious piece of legislation today. It is a constitutional piece of legislation. It requires a 2/3 vote of the Honourable, the Senate, and I want to take the opportunity to say that it has already successfully passed the other place, not once, but twice, where elected officials, representatives of the people, sit. It has already, Mr. President, been the subject of extensive debate and discussion in the public space, where the people of Barbados, who have spoken at great length about the importance of integrity legislation. They may not know all the legislation that I have listed, Mr. President. They may not know the Public Finance Management Act, the Public Procurement Act. They may not know any of those things. They only know that this government, which they went to the polls not once, but twice, which included in a manifesto not once, but twice, as the people's mandate to pass integrity legislation, that we have delivered not once, but twice, to bring the legislation to government, which we have. We promised it in 2018 in our manifesto, we did so. We promised it in 2022 in our manifesto, we did so. I had, under the leadership of the Honourable Deputy President, the opportunity to participate in both manifesto exercises. And I am not in any doubt that the party and the government that the people elected called for this legislation not once, but twice. I am confident that as I read the newspapers, as I listen to what people are saying in the streets, the people of this country want to have integrity in public life. I want to close by saying this, Mr. President. There was a notion that senators, members who sit in this honourable chamber should not be included. If we have the ability to pass or not pass legislation, Mr. President, that the people have voted for by supporting a manifesto, then we have to be included. Pick a side and stay on it. If you have the ability to influence public policy, you have to also accept the responsibilities that go along with it. Pick a side, Mr. President. You're either in or you're not. I want to be clear, Mr. President. We have a tremendous responsibility that sits on our shoulders every single time we come into this honourable chamber. I have not heard, save a few familiar voices, anyone in the public space in Barbados say they don't want integrity legislation in this country. And it is my hope, and I speak on behalf of the government of Barbados in my role as leader of government business in this Senate, I know without doubt that every single member on this government side will be true to the mandate given to the Barbados Labour Party in 2018 and in 2022, as part of the suite of measures that we promised to the people of Barbados to pass integrity legislation. We will vote in favor of this legislation today, every single member. And I can only hope that every other member of this honorable chamber will do the same. And with these many words, Mr. President, I beg to move that this bill be read a second time.
Thank you very much, Senator Cummings. Other speakers? Senator Maladu.
Mr. President, thank you for recognizing me. I didn't realize I was going to speak so early, but it seems not to be many speakers. So I try to use my time with you as best as I can. Mr. President, in reviewing this bill, I realize that this is a new piece of legislation. Quite often, we get things coming to us which are changes, amendments, improvements to fixes. This particular one is a brand new piece of legislation. So I started at this point, which was, and these are my notes, Mr. President. I started at, what problem are we seeking to fix? What is the problem that this legislation seeks to fix? I believe the Leader of Government Business, Senator Cummings, has done an excellent job of articulating the problem in one area. And a little bit later on, I will expand on where I think the problem lies, because I think the problem does not only lie in one hand that claps. As Senator Cummings said, it takes two hands to clap. But this legislation addresses integrity in public life. We do have another piece of legislation in Barbados that I think is referred to the Prevention of Corruption Act. And that more speaks, Cap 144, sir. That more speaks to private sector in general, or everyone, let's call it. And I'm informed, as I'm not a lawyer, that in common law, bribery is found there in common law. You can, that's an offense in common law. There's no statute for bribery, but it lands there. But I will listen to my learned legal friends on the matter. Thank you. Happy to be corrected. So I go back and say, what is the problem that we're seeking to fix? And I think sometimes that this problem is seen by different people in different ways. There is an international perception of the problem. There's a local perception of the problem. And then perhaps there is the actual problem. The international perception of the problem is often described, Mr. President, as a lack of transparency. There's this whole idea of when things get done, are they done above board or are they done below board? And that's the idea of transparency. In the local scene, and again, the speaker before me spoke quite well of many different examples of what happens and what our perception is locally. It is paying to get something done, paying to get something that should be done anyhow, but it's not being done quick enough. There's also paying to get something done that should not be done. That's a whole different other problem. So that is the perception. People enriching themselves who have a position that they can make a decision, and they enrich themselves by making a decision that otherwise they would not have made. But is that actually the problem? Because we have laws, as I said. The Corruption of Act, the Prevention of Corruption of Act is already there. What is in fact the problem? So before I go to what I think perhaps the real problem is, I want to go back to my understanding of the act that is proposed. And I want to focus on the code of conduct, Mr. President. Because, as you know, Mr. President, we're both members of the ICAB. And I understand we have another former president of ICAB joining us in our gallery today. And as such, we have a code of conduct. We're familiar as an accountant, as a chartered accountant, I'm familiar with a code of conduct. I'm familiar with the code of conduct as a valuer, as a professional valuer. I'm familiar with the code of conduct within the Estate Agents Association. We all have code of conduct, what's the right way to behave. This is not unusual. I think it's excellent. And I think that code of conduct that's in the 4th schedule of this Act makes a lot of sense. Let's have it. In fact, Senator Rogers here sitting next to me may tell me that the first code of conduct that all of us as Christians adhere to is what the Bible tells us. That's a code of conduct too. And to be quite honest, that guides many, many people in Barbados and throughout the world. So there are all kinds of code of conducts. So in my review, it was interesting that I came across, and I do apologize to the chamber now if I pronounce this incorrectly, but I came across the writings of a Greek philosopher, Tacitus. And I want to quote from him. He said, in his Annals of the Empire, I think it was called, he says, the more corrupt the state, the more numerous the laws. That made me think a lot about this new law and what was the need for the law. Did we really need this? And unfortunately, sir, I came to the conclusion that we do need this code of conduct. We need guidance. We need this law. But what is the real problem? Let me come back to my central discussion with you here. The actual bill before us, and I spent a lot of time reading this, maybe once, twice, 3 times, 4 times, just really trying to understand it. And I do understand the code of conduct. I do understand that really this declaration that all of these public service people will make is to help us to identify the possibility of something inappropriate happening. And we've created the Integrity Commission, and we have the president who has to look after some of it, the Integrity Commission, and we have a tribunal that I understand the law, I think. But to me, the problem is not that. The problem lies here, sir. In reality, in Barbados, in the public domain, we have seen within the last few years a person accused, tried, found guilty of, served time, released, and returned to, some might say, a hero's welcome. I'm confused, sir. How come, in the face of that information, of that particular story, if you believe where it was being written and so on, I believe it to be true, it says that this person was incarcerated, found guilty of laundering money. Laundering money was taking the proceeds of a crime. This crime actually occurred in Barbados, Mr. President, according to what you would read. But in Barbados, we have not done anything about it. So what do I think the real problem is? Our problem is, Mr. President, that we are not willing to prosecute. So when you, thank you. When I read what the objects of this act, it says to promote integrity in public life through prevention, detection, investigation, and prosecution. That's what it says in there. And I would hope that, in fact, that we would focus significantly on the prosecution, because we did not need this new act to actually do anything about the case I referred to before, or other ones we've heard about. But we haven't done anything, sir. And there's nothing in this act that tells me that we are going to act. So I am hopeful that, having now done and cast this net much wider, that we will actually do something. So let me just comment on some few other things, since I'm probably now in a lot of trouble, sir. Let me continue on to comment on a couple other things to do with this act. As I said, the Prevention of Corruption Act, Cap 144, it already exists. And as the Leader of Government Business said, it takes two hands to clap. I would have hoped that in bringing forward this legislation, it might be closely followed, or simultaneously, we would have done something to capture those who are paying the bribe. Because, you know, sir, I have never heard of one government department one public service officer trying to bribe another public service officer. That's not what is out in the public thing. I don't hear anything about that. It's not to say that the Ministry of Agriculture wants to put in a new pond or something in a lake, and they have to go and talk to the town planning department and get something done in a different way. That's not where the problem. There's the two sides of this equation is the private sector and the public sector. We need to focus on the private sector as well. Because it's the old chicken and egg analogy. When I was researching a bit about bribery, Mr. President, in some jurisdictions, and maybe again my learned friends in here who are lawyers will tell me, the vast majority of the time, you're not guilty of bribery when you pay the bribe. You are guilty of bribery when you offer to pay the bribe. The mere offering is a crime. Receiving it, paying it, that's further down the road. So, to me, I was hopeful that perhaps Cap 144, perhaps it will come otherwise, perhaps the Leader of Government Business will come back and tell me what is on the legislative agenda, and I will be very, very happy to hear that there will be robust new mechanisms beefed up within the whatever service to equally look at the private sector who is perhaps offering these bribes. I was very, very informed, I must say. I much appreciate some of the quotes that Senator Cummings made on the demand and supply for corruption. Very interesting, and I took note of that, and I'll read a bit more about it. And I agree wholeheartedly that on the supply side, the bureaucratic traditions, which I've spoken about in here before, Mr. President, which is simply do that which you are asked to do. When you don't do that within the public service, that is what creates the opportunity or the demand coming from the other side. Public sector wages, agree with you completely. I apply that to teachers as well. The controls that need to be in place, the transparency, all of those things, I totally agree with you. So I don't want to lose my material point on that subject, which was that there takes two hands to clap. And we should not just say integrity in public life. This needs to be integrity in Barbados. I believe I'm coming to the end of my prepared notes, sir. Just bear with me. Speaking to the actual, and perhaps I will follow the Senator Cummings' way of looking at this. Let me speak to some individual things within the bill that I think are perhaps weaknesses, and perhaps we could come back at another time if this bill passes today and fix. As I've said before, my number one issue is with enforcement. And that applies to the existing laws that we have, the existing known situations that we have. We need to focus very, very carefully on that and how that is done. And I don't understand that today. I am concerned that in its first instance, in the first iteration of this bill, the net that is being cast is extremely wide. In general in life, there's an 80-20 rule. Many of us see it in many things that we do. In this case, I would tell you, 80% of the problems of corruption is probably coming from 20% of the positions within the public service. This net throws it around 100%. My recommendation would have been to start in a more narrow way. And I don't mean to exclude the Senate. Let me be absolutely clear. I'll be first to sign up. First to sign up. And to make that point, sir, I want to be absolutely clear. When I read the legislation, and I had understood it, one of the first things I did is I said to my accountant, please take a look at this draft legislation and tell me how you could file it for me. Is it possible? Is it practical? Now, there may be some people in here who look at it and say, well, I have nothing to report. So, all good. There may be other ones more wealthy than me who have a very complicated disclosure to make. So I could only look at mine, Mr. President. And I asked my accountant, how could we do this? And he went through it and came back to me last week and said, Andrew, we can do this. It's not a problem. We can get it done. Except in a couple of areas, I have a little problem. I said, what are those problems? He said, well, it says you have to declare everything. There's no materiality. So, he didn't say this, but I'll make it up. One example might be, how many spare tires do I have for my rally car? They're expensive things, you know, those rally car tires. What if I get that declaration wrong? I'm concerned about materiality at that level. Then they said all the jewelry. Well, fair enough, I only have a wedding ring, I don't wear anything else, but my wife likes the little earrings and so on, and I like to make her happy. I've been married for 30 years. I honestly can't remember, sir, every piece of jewelry that I gave her, and I am sure it's not on my declaration for insurance. You don't quite get everything right, none of us do. Shh. Thanks. I'm advised not to go down that line anymore. I'm so advised. But the reality is, I think there should have been, in this legislation, from a practical point of view, there needs to be some level of materiality in your declaration of assets, because I really do not think that, on a practical point of view, I appreciate that the legislation does speak to omissions or errors and omissions which you did intentionally. But the truth is that for someone who wants to do it correctly, and that's what I set out to do, to see how to do it, and I think I was correctly advised, hold on. You know, when you talk about what your personal assets is, do you remember you bought that small piano there for your son? Did you get your piano on there? What about that chair that you bought? You know, what's the materiality? We need to understand that. The second, in section 23, this one I think is really a bigger problem, which I'm worried about. Section 23 refers to gifts. What's interesting is, I just came from, I'm very proud to say that I was jumping in Kadooman. I seem to have gotten lots and lots of friends, because I had lots of pictures taken. Man, I know a lot of people. I had abs. Apparently abs attract friends. But I have a lot of friends. And this act tells me, under section 23 for gifts, that great news. Any friend who gives me a gift is exempted. Mr. President, you're my friend. Many years, sir. I can accept a gift without you from you, and it is completely exempted. I think we have to be very careful with this law, because in Barbados, as someone said earlier, it's a very small island. And we all got friends. Our relatives. And to prove that something is not a gift just to a friend, was in fact an inducement to do something, is at a threshold there that worries me. Worries me in terms of the weakness of the legislation. And I go back to say, Mr. President, that I do appreciate that this is the first attempt to do it. And in my business, I often say to people, in order to improve a system, you must first have a system. So in order to improve this legislation, we must first have legislation. I accept that. But I would hopeful, it would be remiss of me not to point out where I see weaknesses. I would say, I guess, finally, Mr. President, that I am concerned about confidentiality. I am concerned for everyone who will need to file these forms as to how that should be dealt with in a more robust way. I would have liked to have seen a much more time spent on how confidentiality of this information was going to be maintained. It was interesting in reading in other jurisdictions that confidentiality is not part of the declaration at all. In fact, when you make your declaration of assets, it is published. So in our case, now admittedly, the assets that you have to declare in those other jurisdictions was a much limited scope, whereas the scope in this legislation, as I said before, has no materiality to it, and it is everything. So that becomes a little bit more problematic. But I am concerned about confidentiality. And with those weaknesses, if I might call it that, I was hopeful perhaps that we would cast a smaller net in the initial phase, develop over time the confidence in this new commission, demonstrate a willingness to pursue and aggressively enforce the legislation before we cast the net wider and wider. Because one of the potential problems right now is with the net cast as wide as it is are we going to get people who are willing to serve in these positions if they know, well, they will know, the declaration they have to make, and they have concerns around confidentiality, and their family has concerns and so on? Are we going to end up shooting ourselves in the foot and finding that many of these SOEs and otherwise, we don't find great people who want to serve on it before because this is an impediment to serve? That concerns me. It also concerns me that with the net so wide, with 100% of the people involved in this, that do we have enough resources to really do a good job in the areas that we should do? Or maybe would it have been better to focus? And I could suggest to you, Mr. President, the focus on members of the other place, members here, members of cabinet, members in some other senior positions within influential departments of government, and full stop in day one, with a clear understanding that day 2 and day 3 are coming after we have quit. Would I have gone down that road, sir, if it was me? I suspect I would have. So, not sure how much of my time I use, but as usual, I try to be as quick and as efficiently as I can be in making my comments. I just want to focus in finally saying this. I remain curious. I am the second speaker today, Mr. President. I remain curious on this legislation to hear from my learned friends around this, in this chamber, about what their thoughts are, before I reach my own conclusion as to what might be the right thing to do with this piece of legislation at this point in time. Because it is absolutely clear to me that it is not perfect. It is absolutely clear to me that it is not even a great piece of legislation. But it might be good, or it might be good enough, or it might be good enough to start. But I remain curious. I am going to be listening with 2 ears, because that's what God gave me, and to hear what others have to say. And I will, at that point, when it comes to it, if it comes to it, try to make the best decision that I can in an independent fashion on behalf of the people. With those few words, I'm obliged to you, sir.
Thank you very much, Senator Malado. Senator Robert Solo.
Thank you for acknowledging me, Mr. President. Mr. President, I will be honest with you. After reading this legislation and taking time to listen to some of the past sessions, both in this place and the other place, I was at a loss. I felt like there was so much consensus about the need for this kind of legislation that I should be able to walk in the room and wait my turn, and then when there is time to vote, voice my agreement. I thought this should be the easiest piece of legislation to pass. After all, I've heard many things about the need for a government with such a mandate to act with accordancy to provide transparency for the good of the people. And I agree. I've also heard about the need to counter the levels of mistrust which exist among Barbadians for the government in all aspects. And I agree. And yet, I felt myself compelled to speak based on two facts. The first, as previous speakers would have pointed out, this is indeed the second time this administration has brought such a bill to this chamber. And the second fact is that in generalities, everyone wants accountability, but no one wants to be held accountable. And hence, sir, I was compelled to examine the idea of integrity in public life in Barbados, as we are considered one of the few who do not have such kinds of legislation. Sir, when I was first appointed to this place, it came with a bit of mixed reactions from friends and family, those who would have seen me grow. On one hand, there were those who felt joy and pride. You know, you had the opportunity to start to live out the potential that they've seen in you, to give good service to the people of this country, to bring some form of representation, even though I am not elected. But within that came the stream of concerned shoulder pats. Those who said, you sure? Those who said the quiet murmurs of, you're a good girl, don't get mixed up in those kinds of things. And I could not understand for a while why. In all my excitement and jubilation, I could not understand why this strange reaction. Until I checked the flower bed of my mind. You see, sir, I am a child of both the rum shops and the churches in this country. I have spent many a weekend in both places. And two places in this country where you will hear both the minds and the hearts of Barbadians are indeed the rum shops and the churches. And so I examined the things that I had learned from those places, because it was there that I first came upon the notion that those in high office in this country are in some way, shape, or form corrupt. You know, you hear the general smatterings of them in the good. The only good one is a dead one. All the people in government do is spend taxpayer dollars. And on it goes, without pause, without concern for facts, with no evidence, and sometimes with anecdotal stories. Now, you know the stories of which I speak, sir. Shirley, Saka cousin Bob, next door neighbor Myrtle, grandmother Ernesta once told her a story. And that's a cultural conversation, sir. There is not just a thought. It has become a cultural inheritance in this country, passed down from mother to child, uncle to nephew, until it is hard to find someone who does not carry that position, even, as I said, with no evidence, with no conviction, with no personal context. So I found it an interesting dichotomy that I see that Senator Manulu also found. That we as a nation decry the concept of corruption. And yet, we as a nation also had some gathered like faithful disciples in the dead of night with placards and cheers to welcome home someone who, as far as I know, was the only person convicted and served time for corrupt actions related to his time in government. So, it is an interesting conversation, sir. With reference to my colleague, Senator Manalu, I took a lot of your points. I understood your perspective. But as to your point as it relates to corruption in private life, I just want to direct you to the Prevention of Corruption Act, Clause 11, which does speak towards some of the points that you would have made. But I also take the point that more could be done. But I digress, sir. Even in the youth, and my colleagues may be able, and those who have joined us today may be able to attest to that, giving you future points. Many are convinced that every person holding high office in this country is pilfering the government purse. That everyone, politicians, senators on both sides, permanent secretaries to CEOs, anyone in a position of power, some of their perspective is that there's no such thing as someone who comes to serve. Everyone minute in day getting something. At least those who have spoken to. It has come so far that they will tell you, I fully expect you to be corrupt. And I'm just looking to figure out how I can get something for myself out of your corruption. And it begs the uncomfortable question, sir. Are some of us as Barbadians against corruption? Or are we against corruption that does not personally benefit ourselves? And so perhaps it is time for some self-reflection. To look at that mirror image so often lovingly talked about. And to perhaps tinker with the lens through which we see ourselves and those in high office who do not come from anywhere else but from amongst us. And so our youth can be considered by some to be negatively brainwashed, as I said, that there can be no positive in those who come to serve. And that is amplified by the careless megaphone of those who spread rumors and outright lies for their own purposes. Where we as a society for generations have perpetuated this idea, can we really wonder why it has come to the point where some of our youth, some with skill sets and knowledge and understanding and a willingness to serve, often choose not to be associated with the scarlet letter that is politics. But then, even in that analysis, is that really fair? Are we really fair in that statement? The adage is where there is smoke, there must be fire. And as leader of government business pointed out, we have all lived through periods in this country where we could sit from a distance and see red flags waving as though it is Kadooment or a Barbados Labour Party event. And so, sir, can we really sit here and say that there is no person ever in the history of this country who has held high office, but in fact had low standards? We can't. If we are being honest with ourselves, we can only say there have been little to no convictions, and honestly, some may argue, little to no hope of convictions with the system as it stands. And the truth is, the system doesn't inspire faith. Where do you go to report a bribe? Most of us will answer the police. I would argue that most of my Y generation would argue, I don't really have much faith in that particular branch of things. Others may argue the police are already overtaxed with crimes of a mortal nature. So, where do you make a complaint for a representative if you have evidence of their corruption? Where can you go to be assured that your political representative is being kept at least financially honest? I believe that you and I, through this conversation, have established that with or without evidence, we sometimes can be termed to have a culture of forget the facts, sprinkled in with the distrust of authority, oftentimes planted by grandparents who willingly tell you that a particular politician is corrupt, but give you no guidelines as how to see a good from a bad one, sir. And then, armed into that, are the harbingers of misinformation. After all, as leader of Senate government business would have pointed out, 2 or 3 weeks ago, we all knew we were going to have a short session. Up front, we knew we were going to take an NIS briefing. We knew why we were here. And yet, there were those who declared proudly with their whole chest to the public that there were other reasons why we weren't going to be here. And it shows you how little it takes to stab at the integrity of an institution, at your integrity. So the truth is, the idea of walking in faith in public life in this country no longer holds. And I'm sure the youth would tell you I am mystified by the idea that the truth is we have always had to take at face value that our leaders come with clean hands. We have always had to take at face value that what they have come into public life with, borrowing and investments and so forth, they will leave public life having taken nothing that was not due to them legally and lawfully. And while that would have been the way of the world, the reality is we no longer have the benefit of the doubt. And as we are always reminded in this chamber, we are indeed a new republic. And henceforth, we must push ourselves along the road to maturity. And this legislation, at least in part, because no singular piece of legislation could possibly cover any and everything. At least in part, this legislation will answer a call long bellowed in quiet whisper in every rum shop and outside in the courtyard of every church, that there must be integrity in public life. It demands that those entering high office declare their assets for themselves, their spouses, and dependent children, as was previously voiced. Some have called it a high bar. Okay. Some advise that spouses and children have no intention of ever coming in here, so why should their documentation be in here? Figuratively. But as Senator Tate in a previous session pointed out, political families often bear the burden of the decisions that the political individual takes. The truth is, families always bear the burden of that which parents, decisions they take. And so, even though I understand the burden, I cannot say that Barbadians do not deserve to know that the bar is set high and that it is all-encompassing. But, as previously stated, the power doesn't just rest in political members' hands in the other place, or those in here. We have the power of what I like to call the yay or the nay. We have the power to say yes or no. In certain circumstances, we have the power to frustrate a government's agenda, a duly elected government's agenda. We hold the responsibility to the public by virtue of that power, the power to say yea or nay, to also be held to account, sorry. Those listed in the second schedule of the bill, part 1 and 2, those who have the power to direct the spending of the government purse and to make decisions on behalf of the government. That power too comes with responsibility. Whether elected or not, it comes with a responsibility to the Barbadian people. And we must accept that. So quickly, there are some questions that in my conversations I heard. And I wanted to try to go through the legislation and address them in as much specificity as I could. Real short questions. How can the public have some assurance that those that come to public office or high office in this country come with clean hands? As everyone has previously stated, the bill creates the watcher in the body of the Integrity Commission. It is in this case the eyes, ears, and nose of the Barbadian people to keep record, to examine and investigate the declarations. Because we must make a full accounting of our income, assets, and liabilities. It is not just a cliche. If you want to understand the true interest of any individual, you have to follow the money. The money coming in and the money coming out. And I've heard the falsettos of those hell-bent on declaring this merely a show. But anyone who reads the actual bill, anyone who understands that there must be process, procedure, and repercussions, understands that it provides real repercussions. Clause 17(1), for any person who fails to file a declaration or to comply with the direction is subject to the repercussion of $50,000 upon conviction. Now, I don't know about the rest of the members, but that would severely hinder my quality of life. And I would avoid it. I did declare for me. And hence, you are assured that any individual coming into public life must declare their hand, to use a parlance, must tell you exactly what their situation is so that the public can be assured of what I come in with and what I leave with. The next question is, how can the public be assured that this legislation allows for proper investigation of those in high office? How can they feel assured that if they make a real complaint with evidence, it will not be investigated? Reasonable question. The Commission in 4(1)(b) is given leave to request any information and to conduct investigations and inquiries necessary to verify or determine the accuracy of the declaration. As it relates to investigation, Clause 10 creates investigative officers. Clause 31 speaks to the powers of the Commission to investigate and inquire. 32, the powers to conduct inquiries. 33, Commission's power to summon and examine witnesses. 41, the powers to arrest. 42, disclosure orders. 43, search and seizures. I think you get my point. These sections go wide in allowing the investigator the power to act as is necessary. In fact, the investigator and commission have the power of a judge of the Supreme Court to compel any person to provide information or summon any person to appear before the inquiry and provide documents or testimony regarding an investigation or inquiry. Further, they are given leave to request and other agencies compelled by the legislation to offer assistance in the pursuit of their inquiries or investigations. Further, I want to also come upon a point that was made. Because this bill also places a duty on those who know to speak. By virtue of their employment, such as a public officer, a managing director, an employee, it calls on those who know to report. If you know and have evidence, you are required to put your skin in the game for your country and report. And those who do not are indeed guilty of an offense, and there are consequences for such. For too long, we've settled into the idea that getting involved in all of that. I'm going to do what I'm going to do. But we've gone so far as a government to put forward whistleblower legislation. We continue to add layer upon layer of allowances for you if you are in the dark and you do not want to come forward, or you're unsure. There's legislation that lays out for you. We continue to put legislation on the deck to bring about the transparency we are so often accused of not having, sir. So I want to compel anyone with real evidence, and I say real evidence because we all know that there are sometimes spiteful people who will say, who will use the power of PowerPoint and Adobe and Word to bring about beautiful pieces of documents that have no basis in facts. And so for those who make false accusations, Section 30 is ever there, with a fine between $50,000 and $100,000 in those circumstances. And finally, how will the public know? This legislation allows for those in high office to submit my information. In fact, before that, I want to address some of what Senator Manalu says, because I understand some of the feeling as it relates to my information being out in the streets, so to speak. Sir, there won't be much information on the form for me. That is the reality. However, it requires that all employees of the commission hold all information confidential, and holds penalties of up to $100,000 and 2 years imprisonment for breaking that, as well as it requires employees within the 5th schedule to sign explicitly to their understanding. The 5th schedule holds an oath of office and an oath of secrecy. However, we cannot have situations that many of us see in Barbados. You know, when you hear a juicy story that comes before the law courts, you are so engrossed in it when it comes across your newspaper, and then it disappears into the midst of the legal framework. Well, the lawyers might have better information than I, but never to be seen again sometimes, or only to be seen again as a reference years later. The actual legislation at 16.1 says in cases where officials have failed to comply with the bill, the commission must publish any failure to file a declaration or to comply in the official gazette. Some may argue, few read the official gazette. It also requires it to be published in the daily newspaper and to report the matter to the necessary commission and the Director of Public Prosecutions. And while investigations will be confidential because we cannot mire a name until we have gone through the appropriate process and procedure. And it is provided, sir. There is a procedure for quite a lot within the legislation, if you take the time to read it. It does require that after an investigation or an inquiry, the document is laid with the relevant commission, depending on the particular status of the individual, whether that be the president, whether that be the commission, whether that be the director of public prosecution. And so, at least in that way, Barbadians are assured that they can have at least another red flag as to whether or not they're dealing with a bad actor in high office. And so, to bring this to a close, sir, I want to ask for the support of this legislation. I want to ask on behalf of those within the youth, and I cast the net wildly again, those who may want to step into service. Because while this legislation absolutely will not remove years and years of cultural inheritance about the integrity of public officers, it is a step towards where we need to be. And if we do not start stepping, we will go nowhere. And so for those who want to eventually be a part of service and hold high office in this land, I urge support. I want to offer it as a sacrifice on the altar of making the steps to rebuild the faith with Barbadians. Sir, finally, it is my fervent hope that today, by passing this bill, members of this chamber add our voices and put to rest the idea, because it can no longer be a matter of everyone wants accountability, but no one wants to be held accountable. Sir, there's a song that calls to my heart a little. As I said, I am indeed a child of the church. It goes, "Let there be peace on earth, and let it begin with me." And so, sir, I ask that we let there be accountability in high office in this land, and let it begin with us, those of us with the power of the yea and the nay. Let it begin with us. And with those few words, sir, I'm obliged.
Thank you very much, Senator Roberts. Senator Dr. Hines.
Thank you, Mr. President. Good afternoon to all. That was certainly a riveting presentation that was quite enjoyable. Mr. President, this is a piece of legislation that really has caused me some difficulty. Let me start by saying I'm a political scientist, as people may know, although they like to say, call him moderator. That's not really what I am doing most days, is political science. And I have long said that we need integrity legislation. We need integrity legislation. We need to deal with issues such as corruption in the country, undeniable. And I will not backtrack from that. We do need such legislation. We also need to change the culture in our country, which is very accepting of a lot of things that in other places would be classified as corruption, but we just see that as the way things are done. So I want to put that out there front and center before I go some other places. And this is why I have been struggling with this, because I asked myself, is it better to have integrity legislation that you don't agree with, or you would like to see changes in, or no legislation? And I have to ask this question because as yet I am to be convinced that proposals for amendments will be taken seriously by those of us who have the ability to influence policy and have picked a side and want to stay on it in the Senate. So what that means is we may want this legislation, but we may want to see some things in the legislation. And when we get to a particular place in the proceedings of today, and persons may ask questions and may seek, and some have already sought, as Senator Malalu has, to provide suggestions about how to make this legislation better before it goes to a vote and is either passed or failed, and then if it is failed, you hear that certain people fail it and all sorts of things. Is there a seriousness about amending so that we can have the legislation? Or is it, we got to finish this today? And I ask this question because this is important to people, as the leader of government business, Senator Cummins, made abundantly clear, and as I think is undeniable. I hope that because of this, we are willing, and when I say we, I mean those of us in this honorable chamber and in other places, to consider proposals for amendments so that we can have the legislation, rather than stating, no, we're not going to have that amendment, take it as it is, vote, pass, fail. I would hope that that would not be the situation. But anyway, Mr. President, I don't want to go on to that too long, but I have to voice it as, this is why I had difficulty sleeping. Because I want integrity legislation, but how am I going to vote on integrity legislation that I am uncomfortable with certain elements of? Do I just have to say, let's choose the least worst option, the least bad option, so that we can have integrity legislation, and we would no longer have the reputation of being a country that does not have such legislation, even while we are a country that scores well on many measures, including Transparency International's perceptions of corruption, that index that they have. We are the top country in the Caribbean and have been since 2010, despite a lost decade. Every single year, Barbados has been the top ranking country from 2010 to 2022, the #1 in the region, even in the absence of this legislation, which is not to say that we don't need the legislation, but it is to say that warts and all of the failings, etc., of administrations past, the perceptions of corruption in this country have been better than all the rest of the countries in the region, all, including the ones with the integrity legislation. We can get back to that in a little while, because I have been moved by some of what I've heard today, and I'm not following what I have written here in precise order, so I really have to tame myself a little bit. I wanted to start by noting Professor Cynthia Barra-Giles in her book, I have it with me, on National Integrity System, the National Integrity System and Governance in the Commonwealth Caribbean, in which she focuses heavily on Barbados. She notes that integrity in public life legislation is but one means of achieving accountability. She notes that it is an important one, but it is one among others. And we've heard from Senator Cummins that there are other pieces of legislation that we are happy to have that contribute to dealing with corruption, integrity, transparency, and the like in Barbados. I don't necessarily need to repeat all of them, as she did so she laid them out quite well. But I do want to add something though, because it is important for us to make sure that we are accurate in presenting certain things. So for instance, the UN Convention Against Corruption, it was signed by Barbados, the government of Barbados, the administration signed it in 2003, but it has never been ratified. So this idea, it ain't ratified even now. So Barbados is not really under any particular obligation, having not ratified it. It has signed and ratified, however, the Inter-American Convention Against Corruption. This was ratified in April 2018, not May, April. So all of this to say that if it is that we want to say, to have correct information in the public domain, let us ensure that we are having correct information in the public domain about certain things, right? So Barbados wanted to have integrity legislation, moving towards having it is all laudable. It does live up to international expectations, but in the case of the UN Convention, it certainly, Barbados is not under any requirement, as far as I'm aware, but the rest in here could tell me because there are attorneys here, to that one. But the other one, the Inter-American Convention, yes, ratified in 2018. But let me get back to the main point that I was trying to make. So we are expected to, and we are moving in the direction of dealing with corruption. And Barbados is a place of dualities, I say. I read a lot, and there's a book I've been reading. It's this one. If I had to bring everything I'm reading in here, I have to bring the whole library. This is by Hilborn Watson. He's a Bajan. It is about, it's called Errol Walton Barrow and the Post-War Transformation of Barbados, the Late Colonial Period. It is very interesting because one of the things that Hilborn Watson points out for Barbados is something that I have read about the entire region, these dualities, the duality between maintaining capitalism but putting socialist measures in place, being revolutionary while being conservative, being anti-colonial while supporting colonial mindsets, institutions, and all sorts of things. Being beacons of democracy, this Caribbean is seen as relatively stable, particularly we're speaking about the Commonwealth Caribbean. Beacons of democracies with significant authoritarian tendencies. This is Hilborn Watson, and there are others that support these framings of governance in the region, myself included, but I won't talk about myself. I can name some others. David Hines, 2008, Dr. Wendy Grenade, I mentioned Professor Barra Giles, and we can go before this. This is not something, these are people that have been writing in the 21st century, in the 60s, 70s, 80s. We can look at Patrick Emanuel, Carl Stone. This is a consistent line throughout our analyses of governance in the region. And I mention these dualities because these dualities can be connected to how we are grappling with corruption. Because we operate in a place where we are stable democracies, we look good in a way to the world. But when you look inside, there are a lot of these funny tensions. Dirk Harrison, he has written for the Commonwealth, another book, Combating Corruption in the Commonwealth Caribbean. He has written about Barbados. Barbados is a case study in combating corruption. And he notes as well, Barbados has over a decade, this is a 2022 publication, of ranking #1, that is the least corrupt country in the Caribbean, by Transparency International's Perception of Corruption Index. Some people clap for that. I have some issues with TI's approach to measuring this because it is a perception index. Perceptions are useful for some things. It deals with a lot of experts. As someone who has even been one of the persons called on to participate as an expert, I've had some problems with the questions. And the framings, the assumptions embedded in these are certainly Northern or Western centric and invariably are going to lead us to a certain type of ranking. Invariably. That said, since this is the measure that people like to use and that Harrison has used, he notes this. And one of the interesting things that he notes is exactly what we mentioned. Barbados doesn't have this legislation, integrity legislation. Other places do. It ranks above. Why is this? This is the question he asks. And he comes up with the view that it is because of the culture in Barbados. That culture and tradition mean that, and we've heard this about Barbadians, they're relatively orderly people, they believe in moral conduct. He also noted the fact that there's a level of nationalism and a reluctance he experienced of people to speak to him as this outsider asking about corruption. And he raised the question in there, is it that We rank so well on these perceptions of corruption because there is less corruption. Well, he doesn't phrase it in this way. But what he gets at is it that there is a level of nationalism among Bajans, a level of national pride, where we could cuss one another home. But when people come, we are not going to walk around and say, they got bare corruption over here. So he speaks about this level of silence on page 57 that he says is not about ignorance, but it's about a lack of willingness to speak due to this same culture. So you know this kind of duality again. And this is not to speak, you know, because we can talk about speaking, people talk. But when it comes to these kinds of things, where somebody is saying, oh, I am from the Commonwealth and I'm writing something on corruption in Barbados and it's going to be published and wherever. This is also like how when you hear people say, well, how y'all could say that if the tourists find out, the people that want to come to Barbados find out they're not going to want to come here, if they find out that they have too much crime and thing. Yeah, that kind of, I don't want to say mentality, but I can't think of another word, approach, that kind of approach. As I mentioned, there are issues with Transparency International's measures, and I don't agree with those ones, the perceptions of corruption, but they have another measure which I think is a lot better, and that they use to cross-reference with this index. And this is the Global Corruption Barometer. And what the Global Corruption Barometer measures is people's actual experiences with corruption. How often have you paid a bribe? Received one? Do you know someone who has experienced something or the other? I think this is a better way to measure, and what I think is, to their credit, whatever criticisms they have, is laudable, is that they can cross-check one against the other to say, how is it that countries are doing from the expert perspective and from other people that we have surveyed, and they surveyed over 800 people in Barbados in 2019. And Barbados still does quite well. So that you can clap for. Only 9% of the persons surveyed said that they have had to pay a bribe. That's quite low. Had to pay a bribe. But again, this comes to me with, there are some views about what is corruption in other places that I don't think they do not align with what is actually corruption in Barbados. That can be viewed as corruption in Barbados and the Caribbean. Let's put it this way. I have not paid a bribe, but my child just did common entrance. I'm not happy with the school that they were allocated, because we don't say pass for anymore. It might be that foolish me fill out the form bad, right? And my child got some mark that I believe merits them a place at another school. But I did not understand the whole zoning thing, and I filled out the form badly. I can find out who I know that is on the board of school X and confuse the person. I'm not paying any money. I'm not paying any money. I can try and sort you out, they say. I can try and sort you out. You may have to wait a little bit, but I can try to sort you out. That's not going to be captured in here with the questions that are being asked. They don't want anything from me. They don't want anything from me. And as far as I'm concerned, that's not corruption. That's just a little, as far as many people are concerned, not I, Christina, who are involved in these kinds of interactions. This is not corruption. This is like getting put up in the line. It's exactly a little favor. That's not paying a bribe, but it is a kind of transactional behavior that perhaps should be captured there. Anyhow, I digress once again. But what stood out to me in this report, there's something that they call sexploitation. I don't know if people have heard of that. And again, it's not going to be addressed in integrity legislation. You could declare all of your assets, your children, your husband, your stepchildren, everybody, and sexploitation is not going to be addressed in there. What is that? It is when people are trying to get access to particular services, they may have to do certain types of favors to get through. And what the report indicates is that this is the one area that is a kind of red flag for Barbados, with 30% of the persons who were surveyed indicating that they have either experienced or they know someone who has experienced this in attempts to access public services. this is something that I think if we are being serious about corruption, that we have to look at. I know it is not directly related to this legislation, but what I'm saying is that we can legislate a lot of things, but unless we know the nature of the problem, some of the important parts of the problem that we're dealing with, we're not going to be able to address these problems adequately. And this problem, predominantly as you would expect, affects women who are in vulnerable positions and require certain things, and are therefore willing to do what they need to do to get access to whatever. No bribe was paid in cash that we can trace. And furthermore, if questioned, we would hear that this is sound like relationship between man and woman and all kind of thing. Difficult to pin down, but people have reported this. Next, I want to go to another area. We're talking about integrity in public life. And we know that this legislation is also addressing persons who work in the public sector, permanent secretaries, as mentioned, also heads of department, of which there are many. Some may not necessarily have financial responsibilities, but they're included in there all the same. But if we're talking about those who the public is really focused, when talking about integrity legislation, about the people elected. We know that it is important to go beyond this if we are seriously talking about integrity in public life. But a lot of people are thinking about the people that they elect. And maybe a little bit about people in the Senate, but primarily about those who they elect. And what about how people get to be elected if we're talking about integrity in public life? When does integrity start? When you get the seat. Because it is then that you have to do the declaration. So before then, you could be accumulating, amassing, doing all kind of business. Perhaps, to help you get said seat. But if there's no regulation of some of the activities involved in elections, related to political parties, related to campaign financing, we might be catching the problem or seeking to catch a problem after it has already gone through the editors or finished or whatever. I don't know how to appropriately speak about it. We may be capturing a problem after the fact. So we can't deal with it because the kind of behavior that we wanted to capture has already been completed. Back to the same book by Professor Baragels. She speaks about this, about our lack of legislation on campaign financing. And indeed, if we read those who write about governance in the region, they will say that this is a large elephant in the room in every Caribbean state. We do not want to deal with election financing, and I'm not talking about the fact that we know that candidates are supposed to declare that they can spend X amount per constituent. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about political parties. Who are the people who are funding political parties outside of election periods, first of all? And secondly, and perhaps more importantly, when we are in the heat of the election, who are the persons that are funding? Because if you want to now do some kind of comparison between what people have before and after, this may need to be connected now, if we're following the breadcrumbs or a trail or something, to what happened during the election. What happened during an election. And until we are bold enough, as we are so bold to have this legislation, until we are bold enough to show the full hand, not just the individual, I can disclose everything that I have, including rally tires. If we are bold enough to show what is happening inside the political parties, the same people who are saying that we need this integrity and it is important, and even voluntarily I will declare my hand. Declare it for the political parties then. Let us know where the money is coming from. Let us know if it is that when people ask questions, this suspicion, this lack of trust that people ask about, how come this body keep getting these contracts all the time, and they look back and they see some funding things inside of a political party that they're not being called mischievous. Let us go that route if we want to deal with corruption in general, if we want to deal with integrity. Because are we operating with integrity If we only start after you win that seat, are we operating with integrity? I don't know. I hope that this legislation is not legislation that is being put out there to signal virtue. We have this legislation, so now we are not just number one on this index, but we have the things that you're supposed to tick the box and say that you have. I hope that it is not there to signal virtue, because when I look at other integrity commissions, this legislation establishes an integrity commission. When I look at other integrity commissions in this region, I feel for these people. I really do. I have been reading the newspapers, Trinidad and Tobago. Prime Minister is not pleased with how information about what he may have omitted to file is being used politically, he is saying, to bring him into disrepute. And by extension, so not just dealing with the opposition, now PM, in this case, is also kind of sideways attacking the Integrity Commission. In Jamaica, the Integrity Commission is, I had to take this one, I had to open this one because it had me a little like chuckling in truth. I hope I still have it here. If I may, Mr. President. And this is from the Gleaner, the 8th of June, 2023. And what I read in this report was that Justice Minister Delroy Chuck, he declared that there is no integrity in the Integrity Commission. And furthermore, that elected members have no confidence in the Integrity Commission. So I hope that we're not creating things to say that we have them, and then in the political back and forth and bacchanal and all the rest of it, we are not then bringing the same institutions that are supposed to be so useful into disrepute for whatever reason, because we might not have filed something properly or whatever. I don't want to speculate as to what the reasons may or may not be. This is a problem though. Back again to Trinidad. This year, 2023, Trinidad's Integrity Commission cleared a backlog of not 30, 3,000. I wrote it down. 3,000, I believe it is. Disclosures. So are we going to staff the Integrity Commission adequately so that they can deal with the disclosures and the disclosures are serving the purpose that they're meant to serve? I have read Auditor General's reports in Barbados, complaints about staffing, about resources, about the skills, etc. needed to conduct the role of this institution appropriately. Again, this is important for dealing with corruption. But what is happening to assist that office with all of the challenges that they face, and we are creating another institution. We are creating another one. I heard Senator Roberts Odell ask a question about where it is that persons can go if they need to report some kind of corruption. There are places that you can go already. The Whistleblowers Act has a whole list of disclosure authorities, a long list of them. In addition to which, the Prevention of Corruption Act. Is that the one? Exactly, we have this, and we have the creation of an anti-corruption and anti-terrorism agency. The director is Darwin Dottin. So it exists. So there are already places that you can go to report. A lot of places that you can go. And whistleblowers in Barbados, by the legislation, this 2021 legislation, are supposed to be protected. So people can already go. So I see the Integrity Commission and these disclosures as adding an additional layer, but I want to also know about the connections between these, because we already have an agency that is supposed to deal with corruption, as I just said, headed by Darwin Dottin. So what's the relationship? And this, I don't know if this necessarily needs to be in the legislation, but it needs to be explained. The relationship between the Integrity Commission and the investigations that can go on, and these significant powers that the investigators will have by this legislation. What's the relationship between this and this existing body? I want to go now to other elements of the legislation. I hope I'm not out of time. the bill specifically. Senator Malalu spoke about gifts. I have a concern about the treatment of gifts as well. I went to the model Commonwealth legislation. Where is it? This one here. Commonwealth, the Model Act on Integrity in Public Life by the Commonwealth, in which 18 Caribbean countries were involved in helping to draft. And I much prefer their treatment of gifts. First of all, I don't think that gifts is even defined, so I don't know what's a gift. If you tell me that to come with you on your yacht, and we're just going for a little trip, that's just a little trip, that's a gift. I'm not certain. But we have other things that should guide persons as well in terms of the code of conduct, so maybe that is okay. You know, if you know how you're supposed to behave, then perhaps some kinds of relationships, the receipt of certain things becomes clearer. So that may be fine, but I think it might be beneficial to define gifts in this legislation, because there are people that are going to say, I don't know that that's a gift. What we have in this model legislation is actually the refusal of gifts. I much prefer this, because in saying that people can't accept gifts and then they have to report them, you can accept a gift up to $2,499.59, or 99 cents, right? That is not, all right, let me say 49 cents, because if you get over 50 cents, you might round up like Senator Drake did last time. So let me say I'm 49 cents. And you don't have to say anything about that. It could be one of the handbags. I didn't even know that handbags cost so much money, but it could be one of the handbags. It could be car tires. Who knows what it is? You can accept this gift. I much prefer saving people from themselves by telling them to refuse gifts. That's what this says. A senior public official must refuse to accept a personal gift or hospitality, which might place him or her under an improper obligation or might reasonably appear to do so. And it goes on. I know that we have looked at, I'm told that we've looked at other legislation in the region that is supposed to be good, but I think that this sort of approach is preferable. What is an official gift as well? I think some of these things may need to be defined so that we don't put people in positions where they are unclear, there is a gray area, then they have to go and hand over this gift to the Minister of Finance, and when it is handed over to the Ministry of Finance, what happens to the gift? It's handed over, what happens to the gift? So if my gift is one of these gold chains that's breaking off my neck, when I hand that over to the minister, what happens? I don't know, I'm not clear on that. But I think this is a cleaner way to handle gifts, and it is one of the proposals from the Commonwealth, of which Barbados is a member, and in which Barbados was involved in helping to come up with this model act on integrity in public life. To the legislation again. And this takes me back to the Whistleblower Act. I want to know about the connection between the Integrity Commission and the Whistleblower Act, which talks about disclosure receiving authorities. So I am going to have to assume that this Integrity Commission becomes a disclosure receiving authority. And in this case, what the disclosure is not the disclosure by us, the public officials, etc. It is disclosures of whistleblowers, people coming forward to say such and such happened. The Integrity Commission is able to receive such. And that means that, if my understanding is correct, that by order, there needs to be some amendment to the list of disclosure agencies to include this Integrity Commission, which I think should be relatively straightforward, but I just want to be clear that such is going to occur, so that the two things are complementary. The next that I have is Clause 8. And this is about annual reports of the Integrity Commission. These are supposed to be provided to the Prime Minister, and thereafter they go to Parliament, and I want to know why they have to go to the Prime Minister. In particular, as an example that I had given previously, where we see that individual in another place calling into question said commission. Perhaps there's a better place for the reports to go before going forward to Parliament. And then there's a duty to report in Clause 26 that Senator Roberts-Odell quite likes. And I'm not sure if I like it as much. Although I think that people do have a duty, should have a duty to report, I think that this is a difficult decision to make. My colleague, Professor Fillmore Allen, has written a lot about whistleblowing and has written about how difficult it is for people to be whistleblowers. Not just difficult in terms of staying up and deciding, am I going to do this? Should I do this? What are the consequences going to be? But also, after they have done this, some of the things that they face, despite countries having legislation that are supposed to protect, pieces of legislation that are supposed to protect whistleblowers, it is extremely difficult for the whistleblowers to, after they have blown said whistle. So then to compel persons who are perhaps in this public sector to report and to then place penalties on them, I don't necessarily think this is the best approach. I think there may be a better approach, which would be to encourage. These codes of conduct, etc., are meant to encourage and not to punish people who may be nervous about this, who may not understand that they're going to be protected, who may not have faith in the view that they're going to be protected despite the legislation. They may not have faith that they're going to be protected, and they tell themselves, I gotta go back into work tomorrow. People get nervous and afraid about this. And even if it is for the greater good, it can come at high personal cost. So I understand the rationale behind this, but I don't like that notion. Okay, I have to wrap up. I've already made the point that I wanted to make in general about resources for the Integrity Commission, so I don't have to go over that again. But I want to ask in closing, Mr. President, how do we guard against just sending signals about our virtue to the rest of the world, and perhaps even to those in Barbados, and truly address practices that show the thinness of integrity in public life, the thinness of our approach to dealing with corruption? How do we do this? We have, I mentioned the whistleblower legislation, and there is supposed to be a disclosure monitoring authority. I want to know about the status of this disclosure monitoring authority and what it is doing to give us this feeling that the things that we are putting in place are actually being implemented and they're working. What are we going to do? Besides putting legislation on the books, what are we going to do to truly, squarely address the issues of corruption that exist in Barbados? And I want to say, although corruption is a serious issue in Barbados, I don't think it is the issue in Barbados. Because a lot of what people suspect to be corruption, a lot of the times I think it is poor management, poor record keeping, carelessness, and then we think there's something in there. But especially looking at the Auditor General's reports, we know that a lot of this is just, it's not necessarily that somebody was stealing something, it's just that they didn't write it down. They didn't keep a record, so when you go back and ask them, they can't tell you. Mr. President, how are we going to deal with these things? I hope that we find ways to go beyond the forms, to go beyond the regulations, to go even beyond law, to truly address what is the heart of, as Senator Malalu said, the problem. I thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Senator Dr. Hayes. Senator Cummins.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. I beg to move the suspension of the Honourable Chamber for lunch to reconvene at 5 minutes before 3 p.m. 2:50 p.m.
The question is that this sitting be suspended until 2:55 p.m. today. All the senators in favor, please say aye. Aye. Those against, please say no. The next ayes have it. This sitting is suspended until 2:55 p.m. today.